Andrew Leigh, and also Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Steve Ciobo. Gentlemen, good morning to you. Steve, after the budget, it looked like it was a more solid performance in the budget. Things had started to turn around, but now the trend back away from the government, that's got to be a little bit of a worry as we head into the spring session of Parliament.
Kieran, in shocking news, I'm going to say to you that we of course make policy decisions based on what we believe to be in Australia's national interest. None of us get particularly excited about polls that go up, polls that go down. I mean, mate, there's one of these polls done pretty much every second day. As far as I'm concerned, as far as the government's concerned, we were elected to do a job. That was to stop the boats, to abolish the carbon tax, to make sure that as a nation we get our finances under control, and every single day we work toward doing that. You saw our $89 billion announcement to make sure that both our defence industries and South Australia are on a solid footing going forward, and we continue to pursue economic reform that's in Australia's national interest.
Okay, now on the Speaker, we know that Bronwyn Bishop has departed. Who is likely to replace her this morning? I'm hearing Tony Smith is firming as favourite, although it probably will be pretty close this morning.
Well, I guess they can watch Sky News and get all the latest, but the fact is that we'll know after Party Room. We're lucky because we've got some really good candidates. Andrew Southcott and Tony Smith, as well as veterans like Russell Broadbent and of course Philip Ruddock, and a fellow Queenslander in terms of Ross Vasta. They're all really good people. Ultimately, the Party Room will have its say in less than an hour, or less than half an hour actually, and so we'll get to see what the results will be there.
Yeah, the Liberal MPs voting from 9 a.m. local time, so about a bit over 20 minutes from now the meeting gets underway. Andrew, I think one thing we can all agree on is that the new Speaker will be less partisan than their predecessor.
It's hard to see, Kieran, how we can end up with another Speaker who throws out 393 Labor MPs and just 7 Coalition members of Parliament. We really think it's important that the new Speaker is holding government ministers to account. Question time has its limits, but it is the key opportunity for Australians to see ministers held to their promises. The past Speaker, I don't think, did that effectively.
And what about these individuals that you see this morning? Tony Smith, Andrew Southcott, Broadbent? What do you make of those individuals?
These are all solid people with whom Labor believes we could see a more workable parliament than we've had in the past.
Let's look at this comment today by Joe Hockey, a piece he's written in The Australian, talking about the competitiveness of our tax rates. This is not a scoop to anyone, really, is it, that our income tax rates are too high and they're going to increase in terms of bracket creep over the next few years. When you talk about tax reform of this magnitude and you rule out the GST, for example, like Labor does, how do you deal with this issue of competitiveness in our tax rate? If you look at John Key, for example, New Zealand, they lifted the rate, broadened it to, I think it's to 90% of the economy, 15% GST. They've got a top tax rate of 33%.
Kieran, if you take all taxes, total government as a share of the economy, in Australia it's about a third. In the OECD average, it's closer to 40%. In Scandinavia, it's closer to 50%. We're down the bottom of the advanced world with a size of government similar to Korea or the United States.
But not when it comes to income tax.
No, income tax is indeed a higher share of our total tax mix because GST is lower. If you look at the particular income tax rates paid, they sit at around the OECD average. But we should always be making sure that government is as lean as possible to do the job that it needs to do. The thing is, though, now, if you're going to be cutting away at the tax base, you've got to identify which services are going to be cut. So, if Steve thinks we need to cut taxes, then he needs to identify which services are being cut.
Or alternative revenue streams, like the GST. The consumption tax.
Indeed. But as Milton Friedman said, to tax is to spend. So if you're going to cut back on taxes, you must be cutting back on spending. Debt kept the same.
Or you find other revenue streams, other taxes, more efficient taxes than... and the point Joe Hockey makes is that those who are being taxed at higher levels, particularly with bracket creep, that Labor is mobile. People can leave.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, Labor is more mobile than it's ever been. But, it seems to me if you just listen to Andrew's comments, you can hear the argument being put forward that Labor's softening the ground, they're tilling the soil, basically telling Australians, look, you're low tax now, more tax isn't going to hurt. I mean, that's what Andrew basically just said. He said Australia's in the bottom third of countries. So there's a clear divergence here between the two major political parties. The Coalition is about pushing for less tax, more jobs and a more competitive economy. The Labor Party has an aspiration aspiration for Australia to leave the bottom 1/3 of tax countries and move towards being like a Scandinavian country where it's close to 50% tax rates. Now, that's not our vision. That's not the
No one's
coalition's
arguing that,
approach.
Steve.
Well, you are. You just the fact is
I'm
the Labor
giving you
Party was
facts.
just
I know they're
making a comment.
uncomfortable.
The Labor Party is making a comment that they think that more tax is the way to go, and we know that they must believe in more tax.
Well,
Kieran,
but he's
because-
not saying more tax, he's saying the status quo.
Well,
isn't
no,
he?
no, but we know that Labor must believe in more tax because the announced policies that Bill Shorten and the Labor Party have put out there represent something like $50 billion of extra spending. And so clearly Labor has an adherence to more tax in order to pay for more spending, and that's really the difference.
Okay, I'll get to Andrew on that, and he can have a direct response to this. But
Sure.
the point, I guess, that the Treasurer is Mr Hockey. He's the one who's saying that the income tax rates are uncompetitive,
Absolutely.
and will become more uncompetitive over coming years with bracket creep taking more more people going into the higher bracket of the percentage of tax. Now, how do you deal with this? It's fine to float this, but he's the Treasurer.
Well, we've got to do a couple of things. We've got to do a couple of things. One of the most important things that we did as a new government was to reduce the amount of reckless spending. I mean, everybody knows with Labor we saw just completely failed schemes. Taxpayers' money basically just flushed down the toilet. $900 cheques to anybody, whether they were basically alive or dead. We saw, of course, the failed Pink Bat scheme. We saw all manner of announcements, the Cash for Clunkers scheme. Labor was coming out with these U-Butte ideas off the back of napkins, throwing billions of dollars of taxpayers' money out the door. So we got that under control. Now what we want to do is make sure that we reduce the level of income tax over time, because as the Treasurer makes clear, the fact is that the top 10% of
But how do you do
in
it?
this country.
But how do
Well,
you
as I
do
said,
it?
by
It's
getting
fine to
reckless
say it.
spending under
No, but that's
control.
not the only way you can do it, surely. I mean,
We've got to
just
get
to deal with
spending
bracket
under control.
creep, it's going to cost $25 billion over the
Well,
forward estimates. It's a lot of money just to
Look, it
return
is.
bracket creep.
It is, and I mean, and this
That's
is
even
the
before you
reason
get
why-
competitive.
But this is the reason why we've got to make sure that we focus on making Australia more productive. This is the reason.
Isn't it
and
time
the
that
centrepiece.
our leaders take, Mike Baird's lead and have some courage to say, okay, we've got to do widespread tax reform here, including the consumption tax?
Kieran, we are. I mean, we have that courage. We've taken on board that we need to have tax reform. That's the whole reason we have the taxation white paper out there. We want to get the best ideas. We want to be able to run them through the government mill, so to speak, to look at what we can do to put Australia on a more competitive, more sustainable and more productive footing into the future. That's the future for
Okay,
this
so
nation.
what's Labor's alternative? Because lifting the Medicare levy is not a productive increase. That's actually going to increase the rate of income tax. How does that work?
Well, Kieran, we've engaged really productively on the process of tax reform. On superannuation, you have the superannuation industry, the head of the Treasury, every respected business group I speak to saying that the superannuation tax breaks aren't fair and aren't sustainable. And Labor's put forward a plan to address those, which has been knocked back by the coalition.
For more
on
tax.
multinational
Your
taxation,
plan for more tax.
we've said that we believe that it's fair for some of the world's largest companies to have egregious tax breaks closed down. And then, when Steve's talking about the reckless spending side, let's talk about the direct action plan, which has so far given $2.5 billion to polluters.
But your tax
and yet-
response, I know, it's constructive and all that, that's fine, you can say that, and I guess it's hard to criticise some of the elements like, the multinational thing, which the government's also pursuing, but that's not enough. If we're talking about $25 billion just to return bracket creep, you're going nowhere near it.
We've said we're happy to engage with a constructive discussion, Kieran, and whereas the government says that it will only put out tax ideas which have bipartisan support, we've said we're willing to pursue ideas and argue through reform. We've copped a bit of stick for saying that we're open to a conversation around negative gearing, for example, another debate that the Prime Minister has insisted on closing down. But there's also the spending side. Steve's quite right to talk about the spending side as well. The $2.5 billion given out through direct action, according to the Carbon Institute, will not see us fail to meet our 2020 carbon targets.
Okay, so just quickly on that, we've only got about 2 minutes left, but I want to get both of your thoughts on this debate right now. The Daily Telegraph report saying that Labor's the plans for 40 to 60% reductions by 2030, that's going to cost $600 billion. Is that what the government's argument is here?
Yeah, we've seen the modelling that's come out from the Labor Party, and they're modelling around the carbon tax that Labor introduced. I mean, what's the scariest part about this is not only is it going to cost the Australian economy more than $600 billion, not only is it going to drive down real wages by more than 6%, but Labor's aspiration off the back of their national convention is to go even higher than that, which means that the impact impact will be even more significant. So Australians really will have a clear choice between a Labor Party that's about more tax and about bringing back literally the world's biggest carbon tax that's going to shave real wages and actually going to harm our economy, versus the coalition.
Okay, Andrew, your take on this modelling that's been reported on this morning?
Kieran, I was the conference spokesperson for the Labor Party's conference, and I can tell you that Steve's absolutely wrong, as is the Daily Telegraph, as is Greg Hunt. The conference did not pass a motion on emissions reduction. We did commit ourselves to meeting the 2% global warming target, but let's be honest, the EU, China, the United States and the coalition themselves have also committed.
So you're saying
that
this
target.
is a straw man, essentially?
This modelling that's apparently been released runs to some 300 pages. We haven't seen it, but we know it's old, produced by a department that no longer exists, and doesn't take into account the fall in electricity demand, the increase in efficiency of renewables, and it's really just an attempt by the government to distract from the fact that they'll be coming out this week with emissions targets for 2030, which are likely to fall well short of what
this
the
is
world
tomorrow.
expects.
We're expecting the Cabinet's going to meet today. New targets tomorrow. Very quickly, Steve Ciobo, do you accept the Climate Institute survey, Galaxy polling, which shows 2/3 of Australians want the government to be doing more?
The key here, Kieran, is to get the balance right. The balance between achieving good reductions in CO2 emissions, but by the same token, safeguarding Australia's jobs and prosperity. And that's where Labor got it all out of whack, because they were happy to axe jobs, happy to axe prosperity in order to pursue targets. We're getting the balance right.
Gents, appreciate it. Steve Ciobo, you've got to get to that party room and choose a speaker. A quick break. Back in just a moment with John Connor from the Climate Institute.